Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So if you think I'm not going to talk now because of that, you're very wrong. So our theme tonight is persevere. And Lindsay and I started homeschooling in 1984. I always say that, and I always follow that with, that's what we homeschool dads all say, we homeschool. But we all know that that's kind of like saying we're pregnant. Now, I was involved in that process, but she does the heavy lifting. So I remember in those early days, I tell people that Democrat Attorney General Jim Maddox is the one who got me involved politically. Jim Maddox said in the 80s, when the whole issue of homeschooling came about, that he said this publicly, on record, he did not believe parents were qualified to raise their children, much less teach them at home. And when I heard that, I realized that if people like you and I didn't get involved in this process, people like Jim Maddox were going to be making laws and policy. In fact, I tell people the reason I got involved politically is because I believed God wanted us to homeschool our kids, and the state of Texas said you can't do that. And so over those years, I remember the fear of homeschooling and recognizing the official position of the state of Texas is you can't do this. And prosecuting families all over the state of Texas. People left the state of Texas in order to continue to homeschool. And I remember thinking, you know, we had this lawsuit called the Leaper case. We filed suit against the state of Texas, and it took almost 10 years. And I thought, you know, if we could just win this lawsuit, then we can forget all this political stuff and we could go back to the important things. You know, and as I often say, I was born at night, but it wasn't last night. And, you know, we live in a culture today where we can't even agree on what marriage is or when life begins. And the days where we could stick our heads in the sand and not talk about public policy and just do our own thing, those days are gone. And I want to talk for just a few minutes about the impact. You know, when we started homeschooling, I really thought homeschooling was really about my wife teaching my children. And at some point along the line, I tell people the Lord snookered me into homeschooling. I used to think it was about my wife teaching my kids. And somewhere along the line, I realized really what I wanted is I wanted my children to grow up to be godly men and women. And the Lord finally opened my eyes to realize that if that was going to happen, then I was going to have to be a godly man. And as God often does, He gives you one part of the picture before He gives you the next part and before the next part. And I want to talk to you tonight and try to help you understand the impact of the homeschool community on our future. So I want to show you a few pictures, and I want to ask you to consider what these things have in common. The spread of the gospel, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and finally, the Slave Trade Act of 1807. Those things have in common that great things can be accomplished by a small but significant group of people. 12 disciples turned the world upside down. A minority of committed people gave us the freedom in the American Revolution. And finally, William Wilberforce and a group of dedicated, committed Christians in England brought to end the slave trade. And I think those people have in common, those groups of people have these things in common: a calling, a vision, and opposition. Let us talk about those for a minute. You know, sometimes people say to me, Tim, I don't understand. In fact, this complaint comes on a fairly regular basis. Tim, I like homeschooling. I just don't like all this political talk. This political talk. And the important thing I try to help people understand is to help them connect the dots between our political activity and our freedom to homeschool. Have you ever wondered why you can do a poll and it shows the vast majority of people support something and the legislature doesn't do it? It's because the legislators don't care what the majority thinks. They care what the voters think. So in Texas, there are approximately 28 million people. There are approximately 15 million voters. And in a general primary, we regularly have about 1.4 million voters. So we talked earlier tonight about the number of homeschoolers. So we estimate 150,000 families, 300,000 adults. So that's 300,000 voters. That's 21% of the primary voters in major elections, and upwards of 21% in important local and state elections. We are a small but significant group of people. And it is important for us to understand that our freedom, Jeremy talked about the fact that faith without works is dead. You know, it is important for us to put feet to our faith and to work in these areas. So let's talk about that calling, vision, and opposition. Our calling, and one of the things I wanted to point out tonight is we are the Texas Homeschool Coalition. Not just our staff, not just the people on our mailing list, but all of us who homeschool are the Texas Homeschool Coalition. A coalition is a group of people that are together most of the time. You know, this may come as a shock to you, but homeschoolers don't agree on everything. In fact, we rarely agree on everything. But our calling is to advance the kingdom of God, and we do that by serving and protecting the Texas family. When we go to Austin today, we talk about parental rights. We are there. We're the only major state organization that is there to defend the family. That is our calling, and we want to empower parents to raise godly leaders. There's a reason there are so many people homeschooling. You talk to people and they will tell you, you know, I decided to homeschool because we met this homeschool family and these kids were amazing. That's what we all saw. We saw these kids who were doing great things, and they are leaders. We are seeing them today. Our vision is to raise the next generation of godly leaders and to establish a foundation of freedom for coming generations. You know, 30 years ago, I just thought if we could win a lawsuit, we could go back to doing the important things of life. And I realize now that we are in a battle. Every legislative session, we have a battle. Every campaign season, we have a battle. Sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose. And it just like Dan Patrick said, we were this close in the last presidential election to losing our country. And by God's grace, that didn't happen. I tell people, I was praying for God's mercy. Frankly, I didn't know what that looked like, but I was praying for God's mercy. People said, Tim, I can't believe you're asking us to make a decision between the lesser of two evils. And I said, lesser of two evils, phooey. We all have to make decisions where there are no good choices. But there's a reason there was a record turnout of Christians voting in this last presidential race, and that was because we all looked at Hillary Clinton. And we said, I'm not sure what Trump is going to do, but I am very sure what she is going to do. And we have to lay a foundation. I remember where I was on election night in 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected. And this is what I thought. Praise God, our guy won. It's over. We can go back to doing the important things of life. And here we are. And the reality is we have to lay a foundation for the future in the legislature, but also by training and raising our children. So our goal is to impact, if you think about it, we think there are 150,000 homeschool families in Texas. And how many of you think the average homeschool family has 2 children? Okay, I'm just trying not to overwhelm people by saying that we have 500,000 homeschool kids in the state of Texas. But the reality is we have the opportunity. We are laying the foundation for people to impact kids all across our state. And this is how we want to do that. We have the Watchman program. We had interns. We had 6 interns this session that spent 5 months in Austin. Yes. And Jeremy is a slave driver. Those kids worked an average of 70 hours a week. They read bills. They did analysis. They gave testimony. You ought to go on our YouTube page and watch some of the hand-to-hand combat those guys did with some of the legislators and committees. We had Capitol Days, 300 homeschoolers at a time coming to Austin and learning how the legislative process works and talking to legislators. And then we're developing what we call the Ranger Clubs, just like a debate club, only related to policy and campaign issues all over this country. So our goal is to have 7,762 homeschool leaders by 2022. Our goal, some of you have heard me say this before, we don't have a lot of money. We don't go to Austin and wine and dine legislators and take them out on the golf course. I tell people, and unfortunately I believe it, I would rather be feared than liked in the political arena. And so our goal is to organize homeschoolers as a formidable force against the erosion of our freedom. I tell my friends in the legislature, I like you as a person, and we will vote for you, but when your record changes and you are no longer a friend, then we will spend as much time and money to get you out of office as we spent to get you into office. So we are the advocates for the family. We want to strengthen the freedom for homeschooling and families. We want to require adherence to laws that protect families. There's a reason that we go to court. The reason we went to court for the THSC was because CPS was egregious in its actions against this family, and we cannot allow that to stand. There's a reason that we are suing the Texas Ethics Commission before the Third Court of Appeals, because they are trying to change the law and they are trying to harass conservative groups like THSC and Texas Right to Life and Empower Texans, and we will not allow that to happen. So we want to sow freedom wherever we can. Partner groups, local groups, vetting committees, voter registrations, voter guides, legislative calls to action, and when necessary, litigation. So we want to stand for the family. We want to educate judges and officials. There are still people who do not understand the law. And so we want to help them understand that. We want to encourage parents. Homeschooling is a lonely, sometimes difficult thing to do. In our first year of homeschooling, I came home one day and Lindsay was crying and Peter was crying. It was one of those days. And home education is not a sprint. It's a marathon. And we want to be there to encourage families and finally to support the family from a public stand. So So who is our enemy? You know, sometimes we make the mistake of thinking people are our enemies. The enemy that we have is the enemy of our souls. And we need to understand that it's a spiritual battle. And yet, I love Winston Churchill. I love that speech he gave. There's a new movie coming out pretty soon about Winston Churchill in those days of World War II when he gave that famous speech. We will fight in the air, and we will fight on the sea, and we will fight in the beaches, and we will fight in the streets. And we will never, 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 never give up. And that is the way that we feel about the family of Texas, and we will continue to do that. So we're going to persevere. You know, we're going to persevere. We're going to fight these battles. We're going to win some. We're going to lose some. And we're going to continue to do that to serve God and further God's kingdom.